Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today's video, we're ranking the top 30 running backs on the week for week 6 in fantasy football. Before we get to the video, if you guys enjoy, be sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and go check out our friends over at Betfred. Bet 50, get 250. Thursday Night Football, Commanders, Bears. We've got a boost over at Betfred as well that you can check out once you sign up. That link is down below in the description. Boost for the game. Commanders moneyline, David Montgomery, over 14.5 receiving yards. The Commanders are an excellent team against the run. We know the Bears love to run the football. And I think Montgomery, for a team that runs screens at the highest rate in the NFL, will get involved more as a receiver in this game, as it'll be tough for the Bears to run the ball. And then offensively for the Commanders, I think they'll have do a great job moving the ball against the Bears defense that has been very poor so far this year. They're riding a, 4-game losing streak. I think they bounce back, win on the road on Thursday night. That is boosted over at the Betfred Sportsbook. Again, link is down below in the description. Let's get to these rankings, though. At number 1, a player that I think I'll find myself putting at 1 for quite some time here is Saquon Barkley. Regardless of matchup, the Ravens do present a bit of a problem for them. They're 9th in fantasy points allowed to running backs on the season, but they are 26th in rushing DVOA. So a little bit of negative with a little bit of positive. Obviously, we're not considering benching Saquon Barkley, but he is my number 1 back on the week. At 2 is Christian McCaffrey. I know, obviously, a very difficult matchup against the Rams, who have the second best run defense grade in the NFL through the first 5 weeks. But with PJ Walker likely at quarterback, it's going to make it so that Christian McCaffrey is the focal point of this offense, both in the ground game, running against a very tough defense, but also as a receiver. We've seen him a bit more involved as a receiver with the firing of Matt Rule as well. Who knows what that can do for McCaffrey and this offense in general. Aaron Jones in at 3 might be surprising just from the perspective of Jones sharing time with A.J. Dillon for touches both through the air and on the ground. But the Packers, I love the Packers off a loss, especially a bad loss like one against the Giants last week in London. They're 7-point favorites here against the Jets. The Jets have been respectable defensively against the run, but being big favorites, I think they'll lean on the ground game in this game. Both Dillon and Jones should return plenty of value this week, and Jones could have a big day in the receiving game. At 4, again, I'm kind of getting into these rankings, especially with the bye weeks. You guys need to know, what players. There's going to be some players on the cusp on other weeks or these past weeks that are now in my top 30. So you guys probably want to hear about a lot of these guys. Ramondre Stevenson is my number 4 back on the week. We saw the most interesting part was Damian Harris leaving the game, and there wasn't another back here in this offense that came in replacing him. It was all Ramondre Stevenson. Receiving game, run game. Now he goes up against the Browns, who have the worst run defense, the worst tackling grade. I think they're second worst in fantasy points allowed to running backs. I think they have the worst rushing DVOA. This team has been terrible against the run. We saw it last week with Austin Eckler. A big week coming for Ramondre in that all-encompassing role. Nick Chubb in at number 5. The Patriots surprisingly 28th in rushing DVOA. I think this is a game both teams will have the ball on the ground quite a bit. So I think the Browns, of course, will lean on the run as they always have. Chubb seems to be like a top 5 to 7 option week in and week out right now. He's finding the end zone. He's getting great volume, 18, 20 touches per game. So someone you can rely on for sure. At 6, rounding things out, Breece Hall. The Jets going against the Packers, who are 30th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. It doesn't matter if you put on a Packers uniform, it just seems like you can't stop the run. And Breece separating himself between him and Michael Carter in terms of efficiency last week, especially, but also touches. Breece Hall getting that involvement we talked about as a receiver. I had him far too low last week, and he exploded both with that 75-yard reception, and then was solid on the ground in a big win for the Jets. Breece Hall looking like an excellent buy candidate we talked about last week. He is now a top 6 back for me on the week in a great matchup. Rounding things into the next 6 here to round out our top 12, Austin Eckler going against Denver. The Broncos present a difficult matchup for the Chargers, but the thing here with Eckler is it seems like the focal point of this offense because of their injuries in the offensive line and the absence of Keenan Allen. He's so involved as a pass catcher. They're relying on him on the ground as well. the way things are going, it looks like the Chargers will rely on him heavily. And it seems like the biggest weakness for the Broncos defensively, if you went between run and pass, is probably the run. They're not as stout up front as they are in the secondary. So Eckler should be able to still move the ball on the ground. Getting to Dalvin Cook in at number 8. Miami is the second best run defense in the NFL so far. This is a tough matchup for Dalvin Cook. Dealing with the shoulder injury that he's been playing through from a few weeks ago. I think this is a tough matchup. Do I think Dalvin Cook's a guy you should sit? No, I don't. I definitely don't think so, because this is a matchup against Miami, who are probably not going to be as explosive as usual. Who knows if Teddy's ready? I don't think Tua will play, so it could be Skylar Thompson again, and that kind of makes this game pretty tight, which will probably lead to some more rushing attempts for Dalvin Cook. At 9, Joe Mixon. Mixon is averaging 23 touches per game. So quite frankly, it doesn't matter who he's playing. As long as he continues to get 20-plus touches a game, he's going to consistently be in my top 12. The Saints, pretty tough rushing defense for him, but his involvement in the ground game as well as the receiving game can kind of make him matchup proof. In at 10, Jonathan Taylor against the Jaguars. The Jaguars have a brutal tackling grade, 29.6. This can allow for some explosive plays. Obviously, this matchup we saw a few weeks ago earlier in the season didn't work out well for the Colts or Jonathan Taylor, but I think at home here, a much better opportunity if he's available and healthy, that he will be able to be a top 12 back on the week against a Jags defense that, while I think is still good, does have some problems and can allow some explosive plays on the ground. At 11, Jeff Wilson. We saw it last week. When the 49ers are in a very positive game script, that is absolutely money for Jeff Wilson in terms of fantasy production. Getting touches, doesn't have competition in the backfield. Jordan Mason not really providing anything. Tevin Coleman came in, got 4 or 5 touches, maybe had 8 touches, did absolutely nothing with him. I think he averaged less than 3 yards a carry. Nothing to worry about there. As long as this team is winning football games and in positive game scripts, or really even in neutral game scripts, Jeff Wilson looks like a fantastic player that we added off the waiver wire that is going to be a top 12 option in my mind this week against Atlanta, who are 27th in rushing DVOA on the year. And of course, we've got this team favored in this game against Atlanta. At 12, Melvin Gordon, the Chargers, last in fantasy points allowed to running backs on the year. This is an excellent matchup. We talked about this in waiver wire. I didn't see any of these other guys as ads in this backfield. Mike Boone could be someone. He is in my top 30 here, but it looks like Melvin Gordon has this backfield and a great matchup for him. So he's definitely a top 12 option this week. At 13, Alvin Kamara. Kamara going into a tough matchup against the Bengals, who are 4th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, but big thing here is he led the team in targets last week with their injuries to Chris Olave and Michael Thomas, and he had 29 touches in the game. So we're getting back to that Alvin Kamara volume that we love to see, and that makes him outside of my top 12, but still of high-end RB2, low-end RB1 on the week. At 14, Leonard Fournette. The Bucs in this game against the Steelers are 8-point favorites. That is very favorable for Fournette. This team's been throwing the ball quite a bit lately, but in a positive game script here against the Steelers, I'm sure we could see a lot like we did last week against the Falcons, where Fournette is able to put up plenty of fantasy points for the Bucs. At 15, Miles Sanders against the Dallas Cowboys. This should be an awesome game. The Cowboys, though, do present some problems. They are 3rd in fantasy points allowed to running backs, but they have the 8th worst run defense grade. So I think maybe some of this could be, from a fantasy perspective, they're a little bit overrated. I do think that the Eagles will be able to move the ball on the ground, and it's probably a priority for them considering how good the Cowboys have been against the pass this year. So I'm looking at the Eagles to still be running the ball plenty in this game. I think Sanders is a beneficiary of that, so keep an eye on Sanders and make sure you're starting him this week. Eno Benjamin in at 16. Again, early in the week, this is Wednesday, we're recording and getting this out to you. I like to lean more on the side of injuries and worst case scenario. So in this spot here, Eno Benjamin, if he had the role and James Conner and Darrell Williams were out, this is where I'd have him slotted. The Seattle Seahawks are 28th in fantasy points allowed to running backs on the year. This is an excellent matchup for him. He's able to work as a receiver as well, like we mentioned in waiver wire. So he's definitely someone that if he is alone in that backfield, that I would 100% be starting and no reason to sit him. Brian Robinson in at 17. The Bears, 3rd worst run defense grade. They've been brutal against running backs on the season so far. Robinson's rushing total in terms of prop bets is at 45.5. Antonio Gibson's been terrible on the ground. I think he's averaging 3.2 yards per carry. I think Brian Robinson probably no longer being on a snap count this week is someone you should absolutely start. I think they'll move the ball on the ground well with him, and I think he is undoubtedly their guy inside the 5. So if there are touchdown opportunities, I think he gets them, and I think Gibson moves more into that J.D. McKissic role as we move along in the season as early as this week. So definitely play Brian Robinson if you've been hanging on to him. That's what you've been hanging on to him for. At 18, A.J. Dillon, again, mentioned this. The Jets are a good matchup for the Packers to be able to score and converting these red zone opportunities. The Jets are 26th in red zone defense. This is an opportunity for Dillon to find the end zone this week. He's been a disappointment ever since the first week of the season, but the opportunities are there. He's still getting decent volume. Just needs to find the end zone. I think this is a good matchup and good opportunity to do so against this Jets red zone defense. At 19, Kenneth Walker. Talked about this again, waiver wire. This is a good start for Kenneth Walker with Rashad Penny out for the season. Walker is going to be a weekly top 24 guy for the next 4 weeks for me. Just Seattle, the opportunity here for Kenneth Walker to be the lone guy in the backfield. I expect him to have, 16 to 20 touches per game on the ground against Arizona in a divisional matchup. At 20, Devin Singletary. Singletary presents some really good value, especially if you're playing DFS this week. The Chiefs have a major, some could consider it a problem, but I would consider it just their defensive philosophy. They leave a lot of the short yardage of the field open. They play a lot of two deep coverage and zone coverage that allows running backs to be targeted at an incredibly high rate. Nobody's even close to the Chiefs in receptions allowed to running backs. 9.8 receptions per game allowed to the running back position. We've seen Singletary put up big receiving numbers. He could do it here against the Chiefs, who are 25th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, and a lot of that comes down to that reception total I mentioned. So absolutely start Singletary this week. At 21, Najee Harris against the Tampa Bay Bucks. The Bucks, 5th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. And the problem here for Najee is the receptions. He's on pace for only 44 receptions on the year. Doesn't sound terrible, but put into perspective the fact that this guy last season had 76 receptions. And that's what's got this guy missing from being able to be that top 12 option he was last season. In a bad rushing matchup here for a team that can't move the ball on the ground, he is firmly outside my top. He's 21st for me, so outside of my top 20. Still someone you could play because he's going to still get 15 to 20 touches a game, but very skeptical in this matchup against the Bucks. At 22, J.K. Dobbins. Honestly, when I was building out these rankings, I'm starting to think I should have him a little bit lower here, but at 22 against the Giants are bottom 10 in run defense, so it could be a good matchup. But Mike Davis and Kenyon Drake getting touches last week against the Bengals is a problem for Dobbins' value. If he's going to lose some of these carries, he needs to make up for it in receptions. We haven't really seen it since that first week that he was back. So I still think he's a guy you could play this week in a good matchup, but we need to see more volume from him on a week-to-week basis to really be able to trust him. At 23, Raheem Mostert. The Vikings are 23rd in fantasy points allowed to running backs, but they do have the 3rd best run defense grade. So they've been good against the run. It must be, I haven't gotten too deep into these numbers on this specific team, but it must be more of a touchdowns allowed to running backs perspective. Mostert seems to be the number 1 guy in Miami. Pretty much assured last week. It looked like it. Chase Edmonds I think he had 0.1 fantasy points on the week. So I definitely think that this is Raheem Mostert's backfield. Just not a good matchup in my mind, but still someone in my top 24. Cam Akers at 24 going against the Carolina Panthers. Akers, it seems like the Rams are just dead set on wanting him to be the guy. They want it more than anything else in the world for Cam Akers to be able to be an efficient option for them. It's not happening. It's really not. And the problem for Akers from a fantasy perspective, last week, only 10% route participation. Looks like that's just pretty much going all the Darrell Henderson. So a matchup here that the team's favored in, expected to win against a Carolina team that's doesn't really have a pulse right now. So Akers could see some decent rushing volume, but the Panthers' run defense isn't too bad. Like it's been pretty solid this year. So Akers is someone you can play, but in PPR formats, it's a little bit scary just considering he doesn't seem to have much of a receiving floor for you. At 25, Ezekiel Elliott going against the Eagles. The Eagles are 13th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. Zeke's just a week in and week out, like ho-hum kind of guy. He's had a good advantage last week against Pollard in in touches, but no receiving work. Michael Gallup's return seems to have had an impact on that, but Dalton Schultz might be out this week, so hopefully some of that returns. But both of these backs seem to be losing receiving work with Cooper Rush at QB and Michael Gallup being involved now. So that could be a problem moving forward for his fantasy value. At 26, Kareem Hunt. Cleveland, they lead the league in rushing attempts per game. He's got like a 33% share of the attempts. Kareem Hunt is a weekly, in my mind, RB3, but obviously a guy that in the result of injury, Nick Chubb would be an immediate RB1 option, but for this week, an RB3. At 27, Travis Etienne, the Jags going up against the Colts, and the Colts have one of the best run defenses in the NFL. I know in the last matchup, James Robinson did return great fantasy value in week 2, but he wasn't very efficient on the ground, and I think being on the road here is a place where the Jags struggle much, much more against the Colts. I like Travis Etienne better because of his receiving opportunity here. I think the Jags will need to throw the ball more, and he was much more efficient and has been the last couple of weeks. He went 10 for 71 on the ground and 3 for 43 through the air last week. Etienne, I think there's a chance that he starts to claim a little bit more opportunity. This week, in my mind, is where it starts. Certainly not a guy I'm really excited about playing, but you can if you need to. At 28, David Montgomery. I talked about I liked his receiving opportunity, but the Commanders stout against the run. That front four is really good. De'Aaron Payne, Montez Sweat, Jonathan Allen. It's a great group here to be able to stop the run. They're 6th in rushing DVOA. I'm just not a fan of Montgomery moving forward this season. Khalil Herbert, in my mind, is the better back, but they just don't seem to care about that, getting Montgomery the ball. It's a scary play for me this week, a tough one, because I do think the Bears, if they want to win this game, will need to throw it a bit against the Commanders' secondary that's pretty poor. And in 29, James Robinson, we touched on, and at 30, Tony Pollard, who was out-touched last week, 22-8 by Zeke. So we mentioned the receiving opportunity, which could be a problem. But again, that's the top 30 guys that missed. We're looking at Mike Boone. We're looking at the backs for Atlanta, who I'm not too high on. Boone is a guy I would be willing to play. Like I mentioned, the Chargers defense, one of the worst in fantasy, or the worst in fantasy points allowed to running backs. So I think you could play Mike Boone this week, but I do think Gordon will be the one with the most opportunity. Other guys here like Khalil Herbert not on the list, Nyheim Hines, Darrell Henderson. But that is the top 30 for week 6. If you guys have any questions on any of these players or start-sit decisions you're trying to make for this week, drop them down below in the comments. Happy to answer as many as possible. If you guys enjoy the video, drop a like, subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.